Hey guys and girls, welcome back to another beautiful video on this beautiful channel. It's a beautiful day. How you guys and girls doing? Hope you're doing great. Today we're going to talk about Unity. It's all about Unity and the UI and just getting a hang of the UI, seeing what it's all about. Hopefully by the end of the video you'll have a pretty good idea of how to work with Unity. You don't have to be an expert from the start, but we'll have a pretty good idea of how to work with it. So let's go top to bottom. It's always a good strategy. First of all, there's always a toolbar in an application, almost always. Pretty self-explanatory, nothing really special. You got your file here. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I just want you to open these and just look at what there is. I might go through some of these real quick. So let's just start with file. I mean, you have your saves, you got your new projects and the build settings and things like that. Nothing we're going to look at today, but we'll go through all of these. Edit. You got your assets. Game objects is kind of interesting because this is key in Unity. Everything you have in your game, anything you put in your game, any kind of object you want to put stuff to, like your player or your levels or anything, everything is going to be a game object. So it's a very general term in Unity. I want you to remember this, and that's why it's good that there's a toolbar option here. You can create empty game objects. You can create specific pre-made game objects. And if you look at this, you have different types here. You can just go through these. You got your tile map, your 3D objects like spheres and everything. You got a bunch of stuff here that you can play with. There's a lot we will not explore in this tutorial, but just have a look and see what you can find. Your components are pretty interesting. So game objects and components go kind of hand in hand here. Game objects you can think of as your just basic template thing, like it's just a basic object, doesn't really do much on its own. Components add behaviors and properties to your game objects. So they make them unique or they make them act differently in the way you want them to act. So say you have your player. If I just create an empty player object here, it's not really going to do much. It's just going to be empty in space. But if I then add a behavior to it, for example, move or moving script, then you can move that player or a renderer for the sprite. You can see it. So that's how components and game objects go together. Services we're not going to look at really. You can just press explore if you want to. They're basically Unity services that you can use in your projects. Nothing I want to complicate your day with. So just leave that. Jobs we're not going to talk about. Windows could be helpful because Windows kind of controls whatever you see here. You can change your layouts here. So I could change it to 4-split. It'll look really different. I can change it to anything I want. I can make my own as well. You just move things around wherever you want them. And then you can save it as a layout, custom layout, and just use that as you want. I'll just go back to default because I like default, at least for now. And then you can reset them, of course, if you just mess everything up. And help is help. Nothing special. You can check some documentation, the manual and stuff. I do recommend just going through that quickly. There's a learn section as well, which you can check. It's really nice. Lots of content in there. Check for your updates and everything. So very self-explanatory. Just check this out on your own and hopefully you'll find something interesting. So before everything that is interesting for us, there is a little bar here, a gray one. And there are a lot of things here you can check, some quick actions. So let's start from the left. The first button is kind of your account stuff, whatever you want to do. Nothing very special. You can go to your account and change your settings. The next button is the package manager, which is kind of interesting. There's a lot of packages you can add to your projects. This is also something we'll talk about later. Then there is another button, which is the Unity version control. And then it'll pop up down here if you click on it, and you can kind of version control your Unity project and all that. But I use Git, so I'm not gonna do this. I'm pretty sure this also uses Git. I'm not sure actually. I'll get back to you on that one. But you can open that from here. Of course, you have your play button and your pause button. So you play your game or you build it, it will build everything and it will play it for you. And it will come in a different scene here, but we'll talk about that later, a different tab. Then you have your pause, so you can pause it in runtime, mid-game. And then you can step through your code and stuff. You can step through like debugging and all that. And if we go to the left, we have a undo history. Now undo history isn't undoing all the history you've done. It's just a list of all the things you have done here. So whatever I've done will show up and you can kind of see what's happened. It's like version control within Unity. Let's do that. Let's not play with that too much. Then you have your general search. So this will be used to just search stuff in your project. You can search for whatever textures, specific lines and code, whatever you want to do. You can search for that in here. This is really useful actually. So you can actually put this as a tab here. Sometimes I have it right here. So if I need to search something quickly, I can just go ahead and do that. Then we have our layers, and this is just for you to see and debug your game. So if I remove certain things, it will not show up in your scene view and in your game view, or in pretty much in your scene view only. It won't show up. You can filter things out just to debug it. Then you have your layouts here. So here I can switch my stuff as well, just like I showed you in the window. You can do that here as well. So I can do a force split from here. I can do a reset all layouts, continue, and I can do a just to go to the default, whatever I want to do. So it's a really handy little bar here. So we're finally at the hierarchy tab. The hierarchy tab is really key to your game because it keeps all the structure of your game, all your game objects, everything that you create, the players, the enemies, the levels, everything that you need will be set up together in a way, in a hierarchy basically. So a player might have a weapon and that will be attached to the player. So it will be a player game object and a weapon game object attached to the player. And whenever the player moves, the weapon will move. So that's kind of how the idea is here. And it all goes back to the game objects and how they're set up. So we'll go ahead and just talk about the options you have here. The top here, you have some just general tab options. We'll talk about a little later, so ignore those. But here are the hierarchy options. You can create empty game objects, create empty child game objects, 2D objects, 3D objects, anything you want here. By clicking the plus, you can search for game objects here as well. Then you can click your scene. Now the scene is really important. It's a container for all of your game objects at the current moment. So you can have several scenes. Every scene will be like a level almost, you can think, but you can use a scene for UI as well. You can have a main menu scene, a game options scene, a main game scene, level 2 scene, whatever you want to do. So scenes are containers, and we'll look into that as the game progresses and you'll understand how that works. But just understand that there's one scene right now active, and then we can add game objects to it. And a really good thing to do is to save your scenes. Never let them be unsaved, and never have just one copy of a scene. Make sure you have backups, because it's happened where I've made a huge scene with lots of things happening. It just disappeared because I didn't save it, or it crashed or something happened. So make a habit of saving it and saving backups of them constantly. The main thing with the hierarchy tab, like I said though, is the game object. So I can just create a little empty game object by right-clicking the empty space, or clicking the plus here, or right-clicking the sample scene here. I can save it as well from this one. But I can just go ahead and create an empty game object, and then that will be a child of the scene. And you'll see this little asterisk symbol here says that I need to save my scene, so I'll do that. Now I have just a simple game object here. It doesn't really have anything, but let's talk about it quickly. Now the inspector view is something we'll talk about soon, but I just want to show you the default component that always comes with your game objects. So whenever I create an empty one, you'll get a transform component. And like I said, game objects are just empty things which you add behaviors and components to, scripts to, so they become unique or at least usable. But the transform component allows us to move it about in the world. So it will show up in your scene view, which we'll talk about later. But this is just good to know that there's always one component that shows up, and it will allow you to position, rotate, and scale your object in the world. But there isn't much to do with this one because it doesn't have any renderer on it, doesn't have a sprite or any kind of object to show in the scene anyway. So it's just empty. Now I can drag this around. I can child it to the main camera. So if I were to move the main camera, now the game objects transform would move as well. So I can just show you that. So I'll move the camera, and the game object will be actually local to that, but it's still where the camera center is. So whenever I move the camera, the game object moves. I'll just do Control Z, and the game object is back to the center. But you won't see that in the transform because this is now local to the main camera, or relative to the main camera. We'll get back to all that. Don't worry about all that stuff. Anyway, I can right-click the game object, and I can create another game object below it, and I can delete game objects really simply just by deleting them. And then you can rename them, duplicate them, whatever you want. So just play around with this. You can even open their properties, which is basically the inspector view separately for that specific game object. And this can be really useful sometimes when you're working with two things at the same time. So if I select the camera now, here, you still have your game object open. It's a really good thing to do. And you can see the camera as well. It has a camera component on it. So this is something we'll talk about in just a moment. But this component is really important. It allows this whole thing to work as a camera. I'll delete my empty one and I'll save it. That is pretty much the view or the hierarchy tab. There's not much more to say about it. Just remember to save your scenes, like I said, so you don't regret anything. The scene view is very key to our game. The scene view will represent everything that your scene currently has in it, so all the game objects and everything. The scene view isn't really the game. It's more of how you design your game. So this is your designer, and then you have a game tab, which is your actual representation of how the game looks. They're two very different things. This is great to look at when you just want to see how it will look at runtime, and this is basically where you design your game. You'll see it's locked in a 2D perspective here. If I click on the camera, you'll see an outline of the camera, and I can just move this around if I want to, but I won't right now. But I can click on it, and I can see the camera component, like I said before. And there's one important thing I want to talk about here, which is the perspective and the projection type here. So the perspective is what we're used to in 3D games. This type is for depth, so you can see depth and perceive depth. Orthographic is for 2D, so you won't notice any depth changes of the object. I can put it as far away as I want to. It will still look the same in my 2D view. I just want to demonstrate that. So the best way to do that is to add two objects. I'll actually add two 3D objects because remember, it's still a 3D engine. It's just that we have tricked it to look like 2D. So you can still add 3D objects. I'll add a sphere here, and I'll add a child to that sphere, which will be a cube. I have two objects here, and I'll move them a little bit from each other just so they look a little different. And the thing I want you to notice now is that the cube is a child to the sphere. So whenever I move the sphere, the cube will move with it. But I can also move the cube independently. But anything you see in the transform component for the cube will be relative to the sphere. So this is how far away from the sphere the cube is. And this is how far away the sphere is from the center of the scene. That is how that works. And so if I move the sphere around, it won't matter for the cube because its transform is local to the, or it's relative to the sphere. Now I'll just put it here and I'll rotate the sphere a little bit. So I'll rotate it. You can click here and drag, or you can type it, but I'll just rotate it so it looks a little 3D. So we'll have a little 3D here. There's a little button here to switch between 2D and 3D cameras for the scene. This won't make a difference for the game. It will still look the same. No matter what I do here, it will still look the same because the game is represented by this camera and what this is showing. And if the objects are within the outline of the camera, then they will be shown. You'll see the camera looks like a infinite rectangle here because it's orthographic. But if I switch to perspective, it will look more like a regular frustum camera or our eyes. This is how that works. That's how we perceive depth. But if we do this, if our eyes were like this, we wouldn't be able to perceive depth. So once we have that set up, let's just, you can have a little, you can see your little game view here as well, which is really handy. So if I move something around like this and I switch to the camera, you'll see that live here. So you don't have to switch to the game view all the time. Anyway, so we have our two objects here. I just want to demonstrate this. So if we move our little thing, I'll click on this little lamp button as well. So we'll see the lighting a little better. It's kind of scene lighting here from the camera instead, just to debug stuff. So I'll move my cube really far away, right? So if logically in the game, this should look far away, but it doesn't because we have an orthographic camera. If I were to select my camera and do perspective, you'll see that it changes. Now it shows a more of a 3D representation of the game. And a lot of 2D games that fake 3D or kind of, what am I saying? It uses a 3D perspective camera to make it look really cool. It fakes the 2D basically. And that's how you can get that design. So you don't have to mess about with the sprites. But orthographic is really good to use for 2D because it gives you that default 2D look. Now I'm just going to Control Z. So I have it back. I'm going to save my scene. Now I have my two objects here looking really good. Talk about the camera a little bit. There are a few things more to talk about, which is the clip plane. Now, if you see the camera object is here and the camera thing or the camera box starts a little further away, and that depends on the clip plane. Now I can move that. The clip is basically where objects stop showing. So if I click my sphere and I move it really close to the camera and I move it a little more, you'll see that it now is behind the camera. If I move it right here, it doesn't show. But if I switch the clip plane more and more, it shows up. If you look at that little box, it will show up more and more. So that's how the near clip plane works. A few more things here that we can talk about a little later. Nothing we have to worry about right now, but I did say the color. So if you look at the game scene, there is a color we can switch about. And I will just click that and you'll get a little palette here, which you can switch. So your game scene will switch color, but I just want to use the default Unity blue because I do like that. It's a good thing, not really useful in any way, but maybe sometimes, I don't know, if you want to debug stuff. I'll switch back the light here so it looks like that. Since we don't have any lights in our scene, they're completely dark. And I'll switch back to 2D view as well. Like this, like this, like this. Good. So there's just a few more things I want to talk about, and that's in the bar here. We got the inspector and the project and console tabs, a few more tabs. But let's just go ahead and go through these options up here because they can really make your life a little easier. Let's go through center and global here. This is how you want to move your objects about. So if I were to select center, we would rotate these two objects from the center of these two objects, the calculated center of these two objects. If I would say pivot, it will rotate things along the parent of the object and themselves, basically. So the cube is rotating along itself and the sphere is rotating along its own axis there. And if we were global and local, I'll get back to this kind of the world spaces of the objects. I'll find better examples for that later. Let's leave that here, but just remember that it's here and it switches how you look at your object. So global is the global scene world space and local would be local to both of these objects. That's complicated in itself, but we'll look at that a little later. We have our objects here, and maybe sometimes you want to move them in a grid. Maybe you want to change the grid's look, and then you click on this little button here, and you can change the look of the grid. You can start snapping stuff. So if I want to snap this to the grid, I'll just move it around, and you'll see it's really nice and snappy. You can turn that off. You can even switch how you want it to snap. Maybe you wanted to snap to or in certain axes, along certain axes. You have a few more things here. This is increment snapping, which is good. It's a good thing to know if you hold down Control, you can snap things incrementally by clicking on this. So you can change it here and just hold down Control and move your object and it will snap by the increments you set. And that is pretty much those things here. We can look at all this a little later. You have your little tools here, really simple. You can move your scene camera view around. You can move your objects around here. Like I showed you, you can rotate them. This one is kind of interesting. We can go to a 3D view, see a little better. You can see that you can rotate and click these specific axes. You can even hold down Control to snap them when you rotate. You can rotate them around the Y, Z, and the X and everything. And really, really useful. You can hold the outer thing here and just move it left to right and up and down. You don't have to circle it like this. You just go left to right. Perfect. You have your scaling tool. You can scale the entire object by holding the middle like that, or you can scale it in a certain axis. It doesn't really help us in a sphere, but if we look at it in a rectangle, it looks a little better. Scale it the way you want to. Of course, that represents in the transform component as well. Everything you do in the scene view will be represented here and vice versa. Then you have the multi-tool it's kind of the multi-tool. It's just a different type of scaling thing. It moves the position as well as the scale. This is better for a 2D sprite, for example, to switch the size of it. 3D objects doesn't really make that much sense. Then you have the multi-tool, and here you can scale, transform, and rotate everything in one. Could be really useful sometimes. Nice to know it exists. And yeah, pretty much. Then you have the, this is the bounding volume, basically the colliding volumes. You can change them here. We'll talk about that later as well. But if we click at some of these objects, you'll see they have a collider. The same button exists here. You can change the collider's size, but we want it to be in the same format as the object itself, so we don't have collisions that are weird. We'll get back to that. But that was pretty much the scene view. The game view, we have a few more options as well. You have the important one here, the free aspect. So I like to lock this at whatever aspect ratio I'm working on. There's a full HD one. I like to lock it there so it doesn't look weird. This is how we'll play our game most probably. So I wanted to look that way. You can scale it if you want. You can scale it 1:1. You can scale it smaller, doesn't matter. And then a few more things here we won't really go through right now. Next up is the project tab. The project tab is a beautiful tab because you can add a bunch of stuff here. Everything you organize, all your stuff you save, your images, sprites, tile maps, tiles, everything will be saved here. You just save it in folders. You can create a new folder by right-clicking. You can create your scripts here. You can create any kind of component, anything you need, and save it here. It's like a folder structure, basically. So I'll create a new folder. I'll call it maybe sprites, and then I'll just save my sprites in there. I can create a new folder here, call it tiles, and I'll save my tiles in there. So whatever you want to do, you can drag and drop things. Really simple, just like your Explorer view. Nothing complicated. You can even click on the plus symbol here to add stuff. Of course, you can see the hierarchy of all your stuff. So if I put the tiles within sprites, it will show up here. And then I can go into sprites and I can move that here as well. I can move that to my home folder and it will show up there. Really simple. Packages are the default packages that follow and the libraries that follow your Unity project. So whenever I created this, all this stuff followed with it. You have your Unity UI, for example. You have your sprite renderer stuff, sprites, tile maps, things like that we can use in our game. We'll look at that later. You can add more packages as we go on. But the assets folder is your home folder, and this is where you save your scenes as well. Like I said, really important to save your scenes and back them up. Usually you can just right-click it and you can save as a backup if you want. So it's a good thing to do. Nothing special. Of course, you can search for things in here, and you can search by type. You can search by tags and select labels and things like that. Show hidden packages, hidden objects. Bunch of things here. Really, really simple. Good to favorite things to find them quickly. The console view is your output. If you've worked with any of my other tutorials, there's always a console where it shows your output, your errors, everything like that. You have an error pause button, which is nice. Pauses your game if an error shows up, so you can see exactly where it showed up. You can clear on different statuses, different states. So whenever I build, I want to clear it. Whenever I play or recompile, you can clear your console window. And then you have a little editor here you can play around with. But just remember, the console is really good to look at errors and outputs. And you can filter them here as well. So warnings, errors, and different things, bugs, and you can search for specific messages here as well. I feel we've already talked about the inspector window, but it could be good to see what components there are and how to add them. So whenever you click on a game object, an inspector window will show up, or it will be populated with all the things. You have your name of your game object. Whoops. What did I just do? Okay, you have your name here. You have your static modifier. Static is interesting. We'll use that quite a bit. If you have static objects in your world, it optimizes your game. It tells your game that this object will never move, and Unity will optimize that in its way to make it really quick and nice. So remember that is there. There's a lot of options. I won't go through all of these, but tags and layers are good to know. You can organize your things using tags and layers. We'll talk about that as we go and create our game. We already saw these components here, but let's try to add another component. So you can search for components here, or you can just remove it and you can click your way through. Now I might want to add a 2D physics box collider. I can add a circle collider, whatever I want. I can go back here. I can add a sprite renderer. The camera component, which is already there, is below rendering. I can add UI components, all kinds of things. I can make a new script, a completely custom component, or I can create a new script and I can inherit a already existing component through the script, and I can make it my own. So there's a lot of things you can do here. This is how you change your objects and how you make them work, basically. Audio listener, you don't have to think about too much. Just make sure there's only one audio listener per scene, basically. So it's just stored in your camera. So it's perfect. Nothing you need to do there. Yeah, that's the inspector view. It's really nice, really good. Just how you edit your game objects, basically. Now to end the video and finalize, you can see if you click on any tab here, you can add a tab. There are a few different tabs you can do that I haven't gone through. A profiler, animation, basically those two. Whenever we start working on our game, we'll look at these and it will make sense. So you don't have to think about that too much. Like I said, you can move your tabs about. So I can move my console up here if I wanted to, and I can choose to save that in Windows, Layouts, and Save Layout. And you can load that later on. So that's just really customizable. Go ahead and do that. You don't have to keep your game or your scene just like I do it. And just change it about just like you like it. Sometimes maybe you like your game down here so that you can see your game and your stuff at the same time. And you can move your project window to the side and the console to the side as well. This is a good way to keep it. You can put your inspector and hierarchy on the same side, or you can keep them free floating. Whoops. Just like that. So just play around with it, see what you can do. Hopefully you liked this tutorial and it wasn't too crazy, talking too much, babbling on like I usually do. But I really appreciate you watching this. I'm really excited about this tutorial. I love Unity. It's a great way to learn game development and just make games and have fun. So take care. I'll see you in the next one when we start making our games. And yeah, take it easy. Bye-bye.